SK, let it play, boy.
When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Service, same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers. When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Service, same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers. I wake up inside me a prayer, brush my teeth, babe, then I throw on some threads. Wash my face, grab a cup, hold me some yum, put on my backpack, then I'm off to the bread. I eat these devils for breakfast, gotta be careful. Whole lot of blood being shed in the streets. World is so wicked, I weep for the living, I drop a free tear for the dead. All my white friends in my pocket, or either they loading onto this black card that I swipe. Say every time that I drop it, the verses be hitting more harder than problems of life. Rich, I collected 2 pennies from every person that willingly gave me advice. Being afraid can't exist in my spirit, I'm fearing no man but the Father in Christ. I put in work with the brothers, we stood on them corners from 10 to like 9 to some night, teaching our people the gospel, equipped with a camera, some posters, some speakers and mic. Every time that I see mama, she telling me, son, you gotta walk in the light. Christ, the bread of heaven, keep feeding my spirit, and I wanna load, not a slide. When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Service, same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers. When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Service, same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers.
When I tell you I'm an Israelite, tribe of Judah, don't you take it personal. Plead the blood on these demons, we purging them. Don't entertain Jezebels, we be curving them. Ayy, I got a ribbon, she virtuous. In person, this blue life ain't virtual. I can't forget when I heard the truth. I got cut with that word, it got surgical. Conviction can lead to repentance. I pray these verses encourage you. We repented, now we on the vertical. Judah rising, see Isaiah 32. Big business, nothing minuscule. I picked up that pen back in middle school. Guard your light and take heed who you listen to. Watch your mouth and your ears and your vision too. Hashatan and Shalkani won't finish you. In Mortal Kombat, this war is not physical. Gird your loins up and follow the general. Messiah is coming, that's scriptural. You gotta starve your flesh. The real war ain't even started yet. This look like a setup for a second exodus. I'm trying to be where the water at. Let's get it.
When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Service, same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers. When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Service, same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers.
Yeah, 7 gang, Source Gang over everything. You know how we rocking, man. We right back with another one. You know what I'm saying? Been going live day in, day out, providing y'all with content. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, share this video. Share this video on the various social media platforms. Get the word out there. You know what I'm saying? So more people can enjoy the content that we bring here. Basically, what I'm going to be doing today is giving y'all David Rohl's video. You know what I'm saying? I own this book. I thought about it. I said, you know, should I read the book or just let you guys, you know, get what he's saying in his book, you know, directly from the horse's mouth, as they say. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, he did a great job, great argument. I love this argument. And, you know, when you listen to it, it's rational. So, you know what I'm saying? I'm going to play the footage, and here and there, I'm going to give my commentary and what I thought about it, and see what you guys think. And let me know what you guys think, man. Hit that like button, subscribe, leave a comment. You know what y'all got to do, man. Put on for the Source Gang, where we actually care about doing what? Studying. rigorous methodology. Understand? Researching. These other cats, they're not about that. They're about their agenda, and their agenda is they don't like the Bible, so therefore everything about the Bible, anybody supporting the Bible is wrong. That's not methodology. That's just fascism. A lot of you niggas is just fascists. You know what I'm saying? Y'all on the left, man. We on the right over here. Source gang, 7 gang over everything. You know what I'm saying? Before we get into the footage, man, you already know we got to put that reminder up there that we are covered under the Fair Use Act, right? Section 107 of the Copyright Act provides the statutory framework for determining whether something is a fair use and identifies certain types of uses, such as criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. So we will be doing a little bit of commentary today. We will be using this for teaching, scholarship, and research purposes. All right, so we're well within our right to review and share this content from David Rohl, right, which is an Egyptologist. He went to school for it and got the credentials and the tools and the methodology, and actually went to Egypt and learned the language, broke down stele, learned the history, the historiography of it, and, pretty much dedicated a big chunk of his life, to understanding Egyptology and the study of Egypt. And he said some powerful points here about how, because Egypt is rich, and the fact that it's a historical gold mine, because out of all of the, early ancient societies, they actually carved their history on walls and in stone. So that lasts longer. In the desert, the sand preserved it. A lot of places outside of Egypt can't say the same thing. So you have to give the props to the ancient Egyptians, because what they did, the style, how they recorded their history, actually lasts longer than majority of the surrounding empires and kingdoms of their time. So that's why, many historians, they hinge on Egypt as being the determiner of time and chronology, because they have the leftovers, the historical leftovers, the remnants. They etched their history in stone and wrote a lot of their history on walls, which is preserved. That didn't happen in Mesopotamia. That didn't happen in Greece. That didn't happen in Athens. It was very pervasive in ancient Egypt, and thank God that ancient Egyptians practiced that, because a lot of what we know about that time period, Middle Bronze period, and so on and so forth, when it goes to written history, it goes to Egypt. So we have to give kudos and props where it's due, and the ancient Egyptians did that. So with no further ado, let's get into the footage, right? The footage of David Rohl, breaking down the chronology and the history, and a fatal error, according to David Rohl, that many people make when it comes, or many other scholars make, when it comes to a particular pharaoh named in the Bible, Shishak, and how they equate him to Shoshank. So I'm going to allow him in his video to break that down, and why it's pivotal in understanding biblical chronology and Egyptian chronology, right? So let me pull that up. Let me see.
I got up at 5 o'clock this morning and put this thing together very quickly for you, because I wasn't intending to talk to you about this. But in the end of the day, it's part of this journey. This afternoon, we're going to talk about the actual evidence for the Exodus and the conquest and the sojourn. But I think you need to know why we have this problem. Why is it that scholars think the Bible stories of Exodus aren't true? Why are pious fiction, as they call them? And the reason is because of this mistake that was made with Pharaoh Shishak. So I'm going to have to deal with that for you now. So you need probably to be wide awake for this, and you're going to learn something about the complexities of Egyptian chronology. Okay? So just hang in there, because later on this afternoon you're going to get all the goodies. Now we're going to do a bit of work, okay? And you're going to have to do some hieroglyphs as well. You all right with that? Okay. So I'm going to explain why Shishak is not the Pharaoh Shoshenq that all the historians and the Egyptologists say he is. So we're going to start now with the discovery of Shoshenq I and Shishak. It all began with a guy called Champollion, a French scholar who was the person in 1822 who deciphered the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Very famous, is called the father of Egyptology, because for the very first time in that 1822, we were able to read the Egyptian hieroglyphs for the first time, starting to read the king's names, read the events, the stories that you find on the temple walls. And so it was a crucial moment in Egyptology. It was actually the birth of Egyptology in 1822. Now, you can see there the Rosetta Stone. This is the document that he used to decipher the hieroglyphs in Egyptian hieroglyphs, in Demotic, which is a cursiform hieroglyphs, and in Greek there. So he was able to translate the Egyptian hieroglyphs using the Greek, which we can all read, okay? And he came up with various names like Cleopatra and Ptolemy that he read from this document. But what he really wanted to do then was to go and test out his theory, test out his decipherment by going to Egypt, and he went to Egypt a few years later. He went between August 1828 and December 1829, and he went along with a team of scholars, and he went there specifically with the Bible in one hand and a trowel in the other, to go and investigate ancient Egypt and find evidence for the biblical story in the one part of the world where now we could read the texts. So he thought we can unlock the history of Egypt in relationship to the Bible by going there and reading the walls of the temples. And the place he went to was Karnak, one of the main temples in Egypt. It is literally a book, because you walk the walls of that place and you can read the history of Egypt there, especially during the New Kingdom. You're going to learn something about the campaign, and a trowel in the other.
Let me address Bepi Noku. He said, we left Egypt, which was Northeast Africa, and went back to Northeast Africa, which is Israel today. So you got doctrine is flawed. You can easily come on here and debate any one of us. If you want to set up a debate, we can debate that. Israel is not in Northeast Africa in any way, shape, or form. I know people try to say it's on the tectonic plate. That countries and continent boundaries are not determined by tectonic plates. Borders and boundaries are set up by established powers, by governments, not tectonic plates. Governments established. So in today's world, what we call the continent of Africa, because you can only be referencing today's world because there was no continent of Africa in the ancient world. There was no such thing as continents back then. The concept of continents came, I believe, in the 16th century. And then they started to lump that whole landmass and call it a continent, and then the continent of Europe and so on and so forth. But continent idea is a very new idea. And in today's reference frame and how continents work, Israel is not on the continent of Africa. We got to stop this pseudoology, man. You guys are pushing pseudo information. It is not based on anything. It's just based on an axiom and not based on research and methodology. All right. So I don't know. Becky, you also said that Israel was in Ghana. Like, I don't know where you getting this information from. Ancient Israel is attested by archaeology and anthropology as being in a locality that's known as the Levant or the Middle East. That's according to history. That's according to anthropology. That's according to archaeology. Okay. Now, this video has nothing to do with what you just said. This video is David Rohl giving his explanation on why some people think the Exodus is false, and he thinks it has a lot to do with chronology, and he's giving his reasonings. He's bringing up Shishak. He's bringing up people falsely equating Shishak with Shoshenq, and he's going to break down why he's saying that. He's not just going to say it. Like many of you Negroes on the internet and social media, you just make claims. You don't explain or explicate the claim. You just say the shit. Like the people on the other side of the aisle. You guys not Jews. Explain how we not Jews. You guys, Israel is on the African continent. Explain that. You understand? Y'all can't explain it. So I advise you to just sit back, hit that like button, share the video, and watch the video, and at least try to gain something from what David Rohl. If not, I mean, you don't have to be here. All right. But David Rohl, he pretty much kicked against the pricks on this one and went against what majority of people think. It was like, wait, no, I see mistakes here. You guys got this wrong, and here's the evidence why. Here's my reasoning why. That's the difference between what you Negroes do on the internet. All right.
To go and investigate ancient Egypt and find evidence for the biblical story in the one part of the world where now we could read the texts. So he thought we can unlock the history of Egypt in relationship to the Bible by going there and reading the walls of the temples. And the place he went to was Karnak, one of the main temples in Egypt. It is literally a book, because you walk the walls of that place and you can read the history of Egypt there, especially during the New Kingdom, the greatest empire period in Egyptian history. And he went to one particular wall. This wall is on the outside of the temple. You have the great court there and the first pylon here. But this wall here has got a relief on it, a carving. And it's actually a battle inscription. It's about a campaign of a king into the Holy Land. And so he went there to look at the document, and he found that the people that were captives brought back from this campaign were what we call Western Asiatics, or Semites. In other words, this campaign was in Canaan, up in the north. It wasn't down into Africa. It was up north, out of Egypt, beyond Sinai. And a line drawing was done of this particular wall to make it a little bit clearer. And what you can see here is the Pharaoh smiting his enemies, who were all clustered together in a ritual slaughter. And on the left-hand side, we have a scene where the god Ammon, with the tall plumes, is dragging with ropes attached to his hand here, a series of figures with ovals. Now, we know from looking at war reliefs, what this is a representation of various locations in Canaan, cities or locations whose names are spelt out inside these name rings with figures of the captives above. And I'll go and show you them in detail in a minute. And you can see there's row upon row of these. There's another group down here where the goddess Victorious Thebes is also bringing more of these name rings towards the smiting scene. There are about 150 altogether of these names. It's a huge campaign. Now, one thing you have to know about this particular inscription is that it's an itinerary. So it's actually the route of march of Pharaoh's army through Canaan. And it's read in a special way called bustrophodon. Anybody heard of bustrophodon? It's Greek, it means as the ox plough. So you read it starting here, you go along with your plough, and you turn around and you go down a row and you come back, and then you read it in that direction. And then back again. As the ox ploughs, bustrophodon, like this. So you start here, and you read along, and you drop down, and you come along that way, and then down again, like that. And because we know that, and we know that because of which name rings are connected together, we can actually work out the route that the army took through Canaan. Now, Champollion was stood in front of this wall, and he thought he'd found something very, very important. He related it to a text in the Bible, in 2 Chronicles 12, 1-4. And thus it happened that in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, marched on Jerusalem, because they had been unfaithful to Yahweh. He had 1,200 chariots and 60,000 cavalry and countless hordes of Libyans, Sukkim, which is another form of Libyan tribes, and Cushites, they're the people from the south in Sudan, who came from Egypt with him. They captured the fortified towns of Judah, and then they reached Jerusalem. This is the key synchronism I mentioned earlier. So here we have a pharaoh on a wall at Karnak whose campaign description appeared to match the story in the Bible. Now, was he right? Well, here we see part of that inscription. And you can now see the figures of the captives with the name rings and the crenellations showing the fortified towns here, and their names are spelt out in Egyptian hieroglyphs. And he focused on that one there. He was able to read all these, and he was able to read it in a way that really shocked him, because this is his drawing of that actual relief. He could read the name Judah HaMalkuth, which means Judah the kingdom. Now, he knew his Bible. We're talking about scholars from the 19th century. They're very knowledgeable about the biblical text. They're brought up on the biblical text, and they immediately thought, this has got to be Shishak campaigning in the kingdom of Judah. And it just so happens the name of this pharaoh who carved this wall is a pharaoh called Shoshenq. And he thought, Shishak, Shoshenq, they sound very similar. So this must be the biblical character Shishak, who went and plundered the Temple of Solomon and captured the fortified.
Notice that he pointed out how they came up with matching Shishak with Shoshenq, because the name sounded similar, and they pretty much based it off that. And David Rohl's about to unpack that and why he doesn't believe that that's actually holding up to empirical scrutiny.
Cities in Judah. And from that point, we get the synchronism between the Libyan pharaoh Shoshenq, the founder of the 22nd dynasty, and Rehoboam in his year 5 when the Temple of Solomon was plundered. And that lock has been with us ever since. We still use it today. All Egyptologists use that lock today. Doesn't matter what you do with the chronology, that is a fixed point that you can't change. But within 20 years, other scholars who now had developed the reading of the hieroglyphs in a more sophisticated fashion reread that name. Instead of Judah HaMalkuth, it actually reads Yad HaMelech. And you can see that. This is where you get your first hieroglyphic lesson today. 2 reeds represent Y. The little chick bird is an A. You have a hand, which is D. Then you have HaMelech. That's the K down there. That's the R, the lion. And so it means hand of the king. It does not mean the kingdom of Judah. And what it actually represents is probably an inscription like a monument or a stela that's been erected somewhere in Israel that is a monument of a record of a campaign of an Egyptian pharaoh. And it's mentioned here. And I'm going to show you why it can't be the kingdom of Judah. The first reason is that very close, within a couple of these name rings from Yad HaMelech, we have this name ring, and that name ring reads Aruna. Aruna. And Aruna, of course, is not anywhere near Judah. If we look at a map of Israel, we see Aruna is located at the Aruna Pass, which comes through from the Jezreel Valley onto the Sharon Plain, very close to Megiddo. Megiddo is just located here. It's a long way from Jerusalem. And so Yad HaMelech, which is on that name ring there you saw, must be in this area because it's only 2 name rings away from Aruna. It's nowhere else. It's got to be very close to Aruna. So when you look at it, if you actually look at the distances involved, it's around 100 kilometers from Aruna and Yad HaMelech to the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem. Therefore, Champollion was mistaken in identifying Judah the kingdom in this campaign. When we look more carefully at the text, 2 Chronicles 12:9, so Shishak, the king of Egypt, advanced on Jerusalem and carried off the treasures of the temple and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything away, including the golden shields which Solomon had made. So where is Jerusalem? If this guy Shoshenq is Shishak, surely Jerusalem must be a captive city that you see on that list. After all, it's the biggest city in the area, the richest city in the area. He's not going to simply miss it out. He's going to include it in this relief. But when you look for it, you don't find it. Here you can see a part of the wall where it should be, and you can see that the name rings are not destroyed in that lower row. And here we can read two very famous cities in the Bible, Gibeon, Gabayana, and on the other side, Mahanaim, Mahanaim. So if you know your geography, Gibeon is on the way up through the Shephelah, leading up to the hill country, the road that goes over north of Jerusalem and descends down into the Jordan Valley, and that's where you'll find Mahanaim on the far side of the Jordan. So Jerusalem should appear between the two, and it's not there. So basically what we're saying here is that there is no Jerusalem, there is no kingdom of Judah in this inscription. It's a completely different campaign. If we look at the overall first three rows, this is where Jerusalem should be, and this is Yad Hamelech down here, and Aruna over here. The two don't relate. This campaign is not against the kingdom of Judah. If we look at the fortified strongholds of Rehoboam that you see here on this map, what you find is that they are actually not the subject of the campaign of Shishak. Shishak attacks Judah. He comes up from Egypt and attacks these fortified settlements and goes on to Jerusalem. If we look at Shoshank's campaign, and there's a list of some of the highlights of that campaign, he comes up the coast and then he bypasses Judah and crosses over the hill country and descends down into the Jordan Valley. He then goes up the Jezreel Valley, comes through the Aruna Pass onto the Sharon Plain, and then he heads down and he does a little campaign down in the Negeb. So if you look at that, what he doesn't do is go to Judah. He misses Judah like the plague. He's nowhere near Judah. In fact, his campaign is all about Israel, the northern kingdom. That's where he's focused. He's not focused on Judah at all. And then he's focused on the Negev in the south. So the one place that Shishak goes to, Judah, Shoshank does not go to. And yet, if you read your Bibles, you'll find that actually the northern kingdom of Israel, Jeroboam's kingdom, who is the competing king in this divided monarchy period, he went down to Egypt and was an ally, protege of Pharaoh. So there's no way in the world that Shishak will be campaigning against his ally and ignoring his enemy, Solomon's son, Rehoboam. So the two campaigns, the one of Shoshank and the one of Shishak, simply don't match. All you're left with then is this name Shoshank and Shishak that sound vaguely familiar. So what I did was I questioned this whole issue. I said, you cannot date the entire Egyptian history on the basis of this dodgy synchronism. Is that a word you all understand, Americans, dodgy? It means a bit suspicious, okay? So the conclusion has to be, Shoshank I does not appear to be Shishak of the Bible, the plunderer of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. And once we get over that issue, for instance, this is a quote from one of the leading professors in Egyptology. He says, this is Hornung, Eric Hornung, there remain many uncertainties about the third intermediate period, as critics such as David Rohl have rightly maintained. Even our basic premise of the 925 BC for Shoshank campaign in Jerusalem is not built on solid foundations. So if you have 925 BC, the biblical date for year 5 of Rehoboam, you cannot fix Shoshank to that date because the two campaigns do not match. They are not the same person. The biblical Shishak is not Shoshank of the Bible.
David, could I just ask you a question here? Why is it so important? What does Egypt give the rest of the Mediterranean world, the ancient world?
That's a very good question.
The reason why this is critical is because I didn't know this, but you explain.
Okay.
Oh, my bad. I'm talking with my mic muted. I apologize, y'all. But what David Rohl is about to reveal is the how pertinent ancient Egypt is to understanding the historiography of the known world at that time, and it's because they wrote on their walls. They carved their writings in stone, and it was preserved in the desert and buried in sand. So a lot of what we know about the ancient world has been filtered through ancient Egypt because how well preserved their form of documentation is. You know, everyone didn't have that. Everybody didn't practice that same way of recording events. And as they did it, great monuments, building, writing everything down, and pictographs on walls and etching it in stone. And that's why they were able to preserve a lot of history and a lot of recorded documents that way. You go to Mesopotamia, not so much. Biblical lands, not so much. Greece, other ancient localities, they didn't do the same thing as Egypt. And that's why ancient Egypt is really a vehicle for driving and understanding the ancient world.
Because Egypt is the richest ancient world nation in terms of texts, because of the preservation of the desert, because they carved in stone, they've got so much material for people to study like me. And therefore they lend this authority to the rest of the ancient world. If you go to Megiddo, for instance, in the Holy Land, or any biblical city, Hatzor, or wherever you like, you won't find an inscription on the walls. You go to the so-called Solomonic Day, it doesn't have a label saying this is built by King Solomon. You go to Egypt, and you can look for a gateway of Ramesses II, and his name's all over it. So you know who built that. You can't say the same thing for the Bible lands. So what you do is, scholars date the archaeology of the Holy Land based on finding Egyptian artifacts in the ground. So if you dig up a scarab of Ramesses II in a particular level, you date that level to Ramesses II. It's not dated by the Bible at all. It's dated by ancient Egypt. And that goes for Greece, it goes for Turkey, it goes for Cyprus, it goes for Crete, it goes for Sudan. All those civilizations get their dating from Egypt. They borrow it from Egypt. So if Egypt's wrong, everything else is wrong. Does that answer your question?
And that's where the challenge comes, because people are reluctant to suggest anything is wrong because they've already somewhat poured the cement and it's hardened.
Exactly. It's carved in stone, literally. The Egyptian dating from the time of Champollion has been carved in stone ever since. And the only way to solve the problem is to knock the monument down and build it again from the foundation upwards, which is my job, is to do that. I'm not on my own, by the way. There's a number of other scholars working on this as well. But Hornung recognizes the issue. We are not safe with our Egyptian chronology. It is by no means fixed the way everybody says it is. Egyptologists use the Bible to date the start of the 22nd dynasty. This is Shishak, to 945 BC. The reason is that Shishak campaigned in the Holy Land, in Canaan, in his year 20. So you backdate to his year 1. So his dynasty begins in 945 BC, based on the Bible. They then date Ramesses II, our so-called Pharaoh of the Exodus, by calculating backwards from that position, from 945 BC, adding up the reign lengths, going back through the 21st dynasty and the 20th dynasty, back to the 19th dynasty, where you find Ramesses. So Ramesses gets his date from the biblical synchronism. You following? They then find no evidence for the Exodus and the conquest in the time of Ramesses II. Wonder why? So what do? They therefore reject the Bible and call it a work of pious fiction. Think about what's going on here. So the Bible is used to establish Egyptian chronology, which is then used to dismiss the Bible. Now that's a beautiful case of circular reasoning. Don't use the Bible to date Egypt. Date Egypt from the internal evidence and then look for synchronisms with the Bible. That's the right methodology. Now, I told you this was going to be complicated. Are you still following me? So, if we've dismissed Shishak as the pharaoh who plundered the Temple of Solomon, it's my job to come up with the real Shishak, is it not? Because I don't believe you can knock something down without rebuilding it. So this is my reconstruction. And you're going to be shocked now when you read that subheading. Was Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II, the biblical Shishak? Suddenly, Yul Brynner, playing Ramesses, he's no longer an adversary of Moses, Charlton Heston. He's now become the guy who took the golden shields from the temple. Is that even remotely possible? Well, it is. And it's all about a name, which I'm going to go into now for you. So now we're going to get into really complicated linguistic arguments. This is a tablet, clay tablet, that was found in Turkey at the capital of Hattusa of the Hittite Empire. You know, the Hittites are mentioned in the Bible. Now, it just so happens that in year 5 of Ramesses II, he fought the most famous battle in ancient history against the Hittites. It's called the Battle of Kadesh. Kadesh being in North Syria and the Orontes River. And about 15 years later, after a lot of fighting, the Hittite emperor and Ramesses decided to make a peace treaty. They said, no more fighting. We're going to be buddies from now on, and we're going to protect each other if we have any trouble. Well, this is the Hittite version of that treaty. It's also recorded on the walls of Karnak in hieroglyphics. Now, this is something you have to understand. Just like Hebrew, Egyptian language does not have any vowels written, okay? So just consonants. So when you read a name, you should not expect, in Egyptians, you will not see the consonants within that name. However, the language of the Akkadian language that the Hittites used to record on this treaty, and they use for all their diplomatic correspondence, is a syllabic language, not a consonantal language. So they do sound the vowels. So you get groups of letters, ta, mi, da, mu, nu. Those are all little syllables with vowels. So when they record the name of Ramesses on this tablet, saying Ramesses signed this treaty with King Hattusilis III, you actually get the name Ramesses written in cuneiform Akkadian. And you can read that with the vowels. Okay? Now you're going to get a shock, because you think he's called Ramesses, don't you? He's not. Ramesses is the Greek version of his name. It's not actually the name that it was pronounced in Egypt or anywhere else in the ancient world. So you're now going to learn what his name really sounded like. Well, the first part of his name, because he has two names, he has a birth name and a coronation name. So the coronation name comes first, and then his birth name comes second. You see it in two cartouches. We Egyptologists, we have something called Egypto-speak. It's a sort of way we communicate with each other, so we can refer to these things in our own way. And what we do is we insert the letter E wherever we don't know the actual value of a vowel. So we go Uzamatre Setepenre. That's his coronation name. But on this treaty, it doesn't sound like that at all. It sounds like Washmuria Shatapnaria. That's...
Yeah, I hope you guys heard that, because again, these are ancient languages, and a lot of times ancient languages, they don't have vowels, meaning the vowels are not written into the actual text. And what they would do, like he just said, they would insert the letter E. And he gave you how they would see it in Egyptology, or what he learned in London from his university. So they would put E there, and he said, "Usa Martre set de Painry." That's how they would say it. But once they found the Hittite Trinity cuneiform tablet, he said the name sounded a lot different. Instead of saying Ray, or how we say Ra, they said Ria. That's how that word was pronounced. So, and instead of saying User, he said Wash Muaria, and so on and so forth. So, you have to notate that, man. People will be saying, well, the correct way to say this is Ray, Amun Ray. And he's about to reveal that could be completely wrong. And again, they just inserted the letter E when they didn't know what the vowel sound was. They just put the word E there.
It's actually how it sounded to the clerks, the ambassadors, when they wrote down the name of Ramesses as they heard it in ancient Egyptian. Washmuria Shatapnaria. So Uza Matre is Wash Uza, Mua Mart, Ria is Ra or Re. Shatapnaria is Setepenre. So we call it Setepenre, but Shatapnaria. So when you get to the ancient language, you can start to learn a lot more about the reality of the language and the reality of the names of these people. And we'll do this with Joseph later as well. So then his birth name, Ramesses Meriamun, as we say, is Riamashisha Miamana. So Amun in ancient Egyptian is really pronounced Amana. As we know, Ra is Ria. Mash is the same as Moshe in Hebrew, born of. And Shisha, the end of that name, is very important because in the ancient world, nobody was going to go, every time they wanted to speak about this king, Washmira, Shatamria, Mashesha, Miamana. It was too much of a mouthful. So they gave him a nickname. We call it a hypochoristicon. What that means is a short form of your name. I'll give you an example. Timothy and Tim. Lady Di, Princess Diana. Some people say Dave for David. We all have these short form names. They're not like a nickname, like Shorty or Blondie or Fatso. They're short forms of the name, and it's very commonly used today without realizing we use these hypochoristicons. Well, the ancient world was no different. The ancient world was exactly the same. Kings were called by short form names. It just so happens that Ramesses had a short form of his name, which was used all over the Levant, in Syria, in the Holy Land, and in Egypt. The common folk, the ordinary folk, gave him a short form of his name. And it's based on that. They called him Shishak. Are you starting to smell Shishak in that? But hang on a minute. What happened to the kof, the K, at the end? Why is there no K, as in Shishak? Well, here we have a little conundrum for you. Let me show you the development of two letters from the Hebrew alphabet, right from the very beginning of the development of the original alphabet that we use today. Here we see two letters. We have the Q, the Kof, and the Wav, the W. And going back through time, through Hebrew, Greek, Paleo-Hebrew, Phoenician, right the way back to something called Proto-Sinaitic. Now, later on today, I'm going to take you to a turquoise mine in Sinai, where we find the first evidence of the Hebrew alphabet in use in ancient Egypt, developed out of the hieroglyphs by one genius. And you'll find out who he is later. But in that particular case here, we have a sign which crops up over and over again, this one. You see it coming? We call it the lollipop. What do you call the lollipop? Popsicle, is that right? Over here?
Tootsie Pop.
Okay, that'll do. So look at that sign appears in both the letter Wav and the Kof. But in time, it evolves. So, in the 15th century, in Proto-Sinaitic, in Sinai, it's a Wav. So this lollipop is a Wav.
And this is an older time period. In other words,
So what do you mean?
you're coming from 15th century BC.
This way,
Yeah,
towards
so,
the present.
Yeah, so this is the older on the right-hand
This
side.
is the oldest one.
Yeah.
Then when we get to the 8th century BC, the lollipop has shifted up and now has become a Kof. Okay? Now, what happens between the 15th century and the 8th century? Well, that's where Shishak is located, just after the death of Solomon in the 10th century. So which sign are we looking at? The scribe sees this sign, and he doesn't know whether it's a Wav or a Kof. So our first clue is this Isbet Sata Ostrakon is an alphabet, an abecedary. You can see the letter Aleph here, Tav at the end. This is the first time we see the alphabet written in the 9th century. It's a schoolboy's practice piece on a piece of pottery. And here we have a resh, and here we have a kof, okay, in the right position within the alphabet. So we know in the 9th century, the lollipop represented the kof. Okay? So 9th century, this is the time after Solomon. This is now the divided monarchy period. If a scribe came across that letter, he would read it as kof. Okay? Go back to the time of Ramesses II and the city of Lachish, stratum 4, you get this inscription, again reading bostraphaedon, so that direction and then this direction. And here you will see the letter is a wav. So we have clear evidence that in the time of Ramesses, this letter represented, lollipop represented a wav, and in the time of the divided monarchy, it became the letter kof. So there's a wav, and it's the 12th century BC. On no revised chronology here, this is the date for Ramesses and the conventional scheme. So there's our two symbols from the two sources. Are you struggling to find a difference? It's like if we take this symbol in our modern alphabet. If you don't take it in context, you can't read what that is. But if I put the three contexts it might be a capital I in the word identical. Or it might be a lowercase l in the word letter. Or it might be the number 1 in 1000. It all depends on context as to how you read that stroke, that vertical stroke. So we have the same problem with wav and kof, except it's in a name. And a name doesn't have a context. So you can't tell which it is. So here is the name Ramesses, is short form name, Sisa. This wav here in hieroglyphs is a vowel marker. You don't know the value of the vowel, it could be anything, but we believe from the Hittite inscription that it's an A. So Sisa and Shishak, without the vowels from the Bible. There it is written in Proto-Hebrew, Sin Yod, Sin Wav. And here is Shishak, Sin Yod, Sin Kof. Can you tell the difference? So, let's say for argument's sake, in the time of Josiah, when they found the sacred scroll in the temple, and they read it out to the people, that the scribe, who eventually wrote down the name as Shishak and vocalized it Shishak, had an older document where the word was really Sisa or Sisu with a wav. And that's where the K comes from. So we have a mistake in the reading because of the change of the sign from wav to kof, which is why Shisha becomes Shishak. So in fact, Ramesses II in his Hypercharisticon, known in Israel as Shisha, is Shishak of the Bible, plunderer of Solomon's temple. That is the big mistake in chronology. Because now we're in a situation where everything was tied to that link between Shoshank and Shishak, and Ramesses was assigned to Moses. Everything was out of kilter because what we had wrong was we identified the wrong king who plundered the Temple of Solomon, and in fact it's Ramesses II. So now we've got a situation on our hands where everything in the timeline is now floating. We have now a chance to see how it really fits together. And that is the key to understanding how the mechanism that leads to the film works. None of this is in the film. You don't get this in the film because it's too complicated to put on a big screen.
Well, here's the thing from a filmmaking standpoint, because this idea is, many people will say, radical, blasphemy. This is not part of our orthodoxy. And yet David, as he continued to defend his ideas, they continued to make sense. And some people said, well, they make too much sense, so they can't be right. I guess in the academic world, if it makes sense, it can't be right because everything else, doesn't make sense. So
the expression they use is, it's too good to be true.
Too good to be true.
Have you heard that one before?
But I have to tell you that there are other examples of evidence for the biblical narrative showing up earlier, like the 104th Psalm, I believe. Is that correct?
Psalm 104.
Yeah, Psalm 104 shows up earlier, and it's attributed to Akhenaten.
Correct.
And because of that, what they are saying, even at Christian universities, is that the Bible gathered its sources from a variety of places. And
David nicked it from Akhenaten, is what they say, to put it politely.
And
instead of it being the creation of David, and then Akhenaten borrowed it from David, because in this timeline you're going to, Akhenaten is actually contemporary with David. So the two of them are reigning at the same time. What Psalm 104 comes into Egypt as the hymn to the sun, and you have the two at exactly the same time period.
And what did Akhenaten do? What did he say? There was only one?
He said there was only one God. And so he gets labeled by historians as the first monotheist. Okay? But with this revised chronology, everything goes back to normal. Moses becomes the first monotheist. And Akhenaten is the copier, not the originator.
And David, wouldn't you say that what you were suggesting too is that the problems aren't necessarily, he didn't start with the Bible. He just basically ended up saying, well, how did this impact the biblical narrative? What he started with was that Egypt has pharaohs, the whole dating of the pharaohs and things were out of place.
No, my PhD thesis was on the Third Intermediate Period.
Right.
It had nothing to do with the Bible at all.
But he just then said, well, what are the other communities that this affects? And then all the other patterns started to show up. And so as a filmmaker says, am I going to make a film that's dodgy, as you would say? Dodgy. Yes. I said, well, let's look and see how dodgy this really is. And actually, there is a sequential pattern, and we've only showed you part of it. There's a lot more to the patterns. And what I would say is that I'm going to say you have to make up your mind. We're going to show you strong evidence, and then the evidence and the Bible, you can think about that and make your own decisions. And that releases everyone from us saying, well, this is exactly this or whatever. But
High Be Praised says, if Ramesses II was Shishak, when was the Sea People invasion on the Battle of the Haji by Ramesses III? But that's what he's saying. All of that would, conform with it. So that would happen. The invasion that he's talking about, if Ramesses II even did the invasion, if he's invoking that would happen before Ramesses III. So he's not moving Ramesses III up in time. He's keeping Ramesses III there. And what are we talking about? 12th century BCE? I'm going off the dome, so don't hold me. But if that's the case, then the rest of the history, Ramesses III after that will be in the same place. If I'm understanding, the information and what you're asking correctly. All right, let's get back to this clip.
Makes too much sense to me as a filmmaker. I couldn't make a film if it wasn't something there. You can't write a story and you can't look at these things. We're not doing smoke and mirrors here. And like Brian Wood said, I didn't plant the evidence in the ground. You can't do that. All you can do is interpret it. And so what his interpretation does make sense. And that's the reason why I felt that you needed to know. Otherwise, right?
Yeah, it's not just that, though. I mean, for me, at least, and I would have thought for most people, normal people, isn't this exciting to be able to re-examine all this stuff and try and piece it together? Why are these archaeologists and historians so scared of it? Why don't they want to talk about it? Tell me a little thing about, I'm not going to mention any names here of any particular colleges, but the film was shown a few nights ago at a very, very, very impressive and important college in this country, biblical college. And they said they would show it on the basis that I would not turn up to defend it. Okay, and then they gave this diatribe, having seen the film, saying why it was completely rubbish and nothing worked, and they just launched into their student body without anybody there to defend the position of the film or anything. Their attitude, one of the scholars, a very famous scholar, stuck a photograph of me up when I was a rock and roll star on the screen and said, would you trust this man to reconstruct your history for you? Because look, he's a rock and roll person, he's not a real scholar. Ignoring all my degrees and all my other things that I've got. Anyway, we're going to wind up very soon. But I just want to show you why Ramesses is the key to all this. Now, it's all about this thing called the Israel Stela. Have you heard of that? It's the most famous inscription in Egypt because it's a great stela by King Meneptah, which mentions Israel at the bottom of it, which is why it's called the Israel Stela. Here is the name Israel at the bottom. You can hardly make it out, but if I just highlight the text, you have the two reeds again that we saw earlier, which is the Y, Yish, then you have S, then you have the R, the mouth, Ri, Al. Now, in Egyptian, there is no letter for L, so they use the letter for R. So Israel, and then you have the throw stick, which is the determinative figure for an Asiatic or a Semite. Then you have two figures, the man and the woman, seated together, with plural strokes at the bottom. Now, those plural strokes indicate that this is a people. So it's the people of Israel that's written here, or the nation of Israel. Now, remember that Meremptah is the successor of Ramesses II. Ramesses II reigned for 66 years. His son came to the throne in old age, and he recorded this inscription. He wasn't really in a position to do much fighting himself. He was rather too old to do so. And nevertheless, he mentions the defeat of a people of Israel. Now, what is the context of this? Well, the text actually says, Israel, and then it continues, is laid waste. His seed, because his, referring to Jacob, Israel, is no more. That's a standard phrase within Egyptian texts for defeated people. It doesn't mean anything specific. It just means we've defeated Israel. They're conquered. Now, the Meremptah stele indicates a nation of Israel already existing in the Holy Land during the late 19th dynasty. Now, if you think about it, if Moses was a contemporary of Ramesses and the Israelites had left in the reign of Ramesses II, how on earth could they be a nation already established in Canaan? They were wandering around the wilderness for 40 years. This doesn't make sense. If we look at the context of the text, it's actually a poem. It actually goes for several lines describing lots of different nations, and I'll just show you the actual poem itself. It says, the princes are prostrate, saying shalom. And it does actually say shalom in the text. Not one raises his head amongst the nine bows. The nine bows are the traditional enemies of Egypt. Desolation is for Chehenu. Chehenu is Libya. Hatti, the Hittites, is pacified. Plundered is Parcanaan with every evil. Carried off is Ashkelon. Seized upon is Gezer. Yanoam is made non-existent. Now, there are 4 major towns in the Holy Land. Then it goes, Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. Charu, which is Syria, has become a widow because of Egypt. Then the last 2 lines are, all lands together are pacified, everyone who was restless has been bound. Now, people have studied this text and realized something. It's actually balanced. It's actually what we call a reflection poem. In other words, if I put the units in, you can see it starts with 2 lines, 2 sentences, and it ends with 2 general sentences. So there's actually a pattern evolving here. It's another one of these patterns. It then has, B, 2 major entities. Chehenu is the entire Libya. Hatti is the entire Turkey. Then it has Israel, wherever that is, and the entire Syria. So in this context, Israel is a major power. It's as big as the Hittites. It's as big as the Libyans. It's as big as Syria. And then in the middle, we get 4 towns. Parcanaan is Gaza. Ashkelon, you know, is one of the Philistine cities. Gezer and Yanoam. So this tells us straight away, this is not a bunch of Israelites wandering around the desert. This is an actual kingdom we're dealing with here, a major power. That is not possible if Moses is a contemporary of Ramesses II. It's out of the question. Whereas if Ramesses II is a contemporary of Solomon, which we just worked out because he's Shishak, then we have a completely different ballgame here. We have the kingdom of Solomon mentioned here in this text. So here are the inscriptions of that text actually on the walls of Karnak. The poem is actually a scribe comes along, he wanders along the walls of Karnak, he writes down all the defeated peoples, and he makes this poem for his master, Pharaoh Meneptah. So here is the Libyans being fought, Chehenu being defeated by the Pharaoh. Here are the Hittites on the same wall, being taken away in captive. And then we have the city of Parcanaan, the next one in the list here, Gaza, with the Shasu Bedouin. There's the name, you can read it here, Dimien, which is the city of Parcanaan, Gaza. Now, all these places are located on the wall reliefs of Seti I, who is the grandfather of Meneptah. So the first 3 defeated enemies of Egypt, Chehenu, Hatti, and Parcanaan, are drawn from the victorious campaigns of Seti I at Karnak. So if we then go round to the other side of the hypostyle hall to look at the campaigns there, the remaining 5 defeated enemies, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, Israel, and Kharu, Syria, are drawn from the victorious campaigns of Ramesses II, which are on the far side of the temple. So if we look at a map or a plan, this is the hypostyle hall between the second pylon and the third pylon. This is where the Shishak relief is, outside here. He's campaigning into northern Israel. And what we have is the battle against Libya. Chehanu is on the outside wall here. On the upper register is the battle against the Hittites, Hatti, and then we have Parcanan on this wall here. All those are set in the first campaigns. Then we cross over to the far side, and we get the campaigns of Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, and Israel there, and we get the campaign against Syria along here. So if you walk around Karnak, it matches exactly with the poem. Okay, so these are not the victories of Meneptah. They are the victories of his dynasty, his grandfather and father. He's too old to do any of this. So he's claiming for his dynasty as he sits on the throne, as I look out upon my empire, this is what my dynasty has achieved. So here we have a golden opportunity to actually look at the defeat of Israel on the walls of Karnak. Instead of having a text, we now have visuals we can look at. So I'm going to show you what we have of that. Sadly, it's very scanty. So here is the Syria wall on the outside of the temple, and we're going to go over here to this area to look at this particular wall. We call it the Ashkelon wall today. In the center, we have the Hittite treaty here, and we have 4 campaigns, one there, one above, mostly destroyed, and then tantalizing just a few blocks of a scene on this side. And unfortunately, that's where Israel's located. So we have Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, and Israel. So I'm going to take you to look at those few blocks. Here we see the campaign against Ashkelon. Here's the town here. Do you remember the story in the Bible of the king of Moab offering his own child when the Israelites come to besiege the city? Well, here we have the king dropping his own child off the battlements in sacrifice to stop Ramesses II from defeating them. But above this scene, here's the name Ashkelon, Ashkelana.
Did you hear what he said about that sacrifice and sacrificing the son and how that lines up with what the Moabite did in the Bible? That gives the biblical account what we call contextual plausibility, because some of these things that are mentioned in the biblical record and the biblical narrative is lining up with actual historical traditions and historical traits, what people did during that time, during the said reading. So when you bring up, and that's one of the strongest arguments for the biblical narrative, how would they know that this was a particular practice during the time that they wrote about? That's called contextual plausibility. The same thing with Abraham. Abraham knew about certain customs, like splitting the goat in half, the practice of sacrificing in that way, his servant being his heir if he didn't have any seed, not being able to kick his wife Hagar out, the fact that Hagar became the maidservant, the maidservant became the woman that was supposed to give him a seed because his wife wasn't able to. These are all customs that are around the time of Abraham's existence. So how would they know about these customs? Because they observed these customs and recorded these customs and passed them down. That's what contextual plausibility is about. All right.
This is what we're interested in. That is what's left of the battle against Israel. Now, you can't see very much, I admit, but when you examine it closely, there's a melee here. There's lots of bodies being killed here. We have a horse here. We have a chariot wheel. We have a larger horse, the back legs of a larger horse. I'll try and help you out with this.
Now, this point right here was a very poignant point about the chariots and the horses. And he's going to bring up the Bible to, try to map out when this was actually going down according to the biblical chronology.
And then we have captives being taken away with long gowns on down to their ankles, taken off as prisoners towards Egypt. Now, that's what we have today, but what I was able to do was take a similar scene from another part of Karnak to reconstruct that so you can see what it is. So watch this happen and you'll see what the scene is all about. So now you can see clearly what it is. You have Ramesses II and his chariot over here on the missing section. His chariot horses here, the large ones, prancing with the reins of the king going across here. And underneath the horses of the chariot team, is a smaller chariot with a small wheel, in which we have Semites falling dead. And the horse, if you notice here, the tiny horse is running away from the battle, running away from Ramesses in defeat. So what is this representing? There you can see the horse in more detail. You'll notice here, if we go closer, the head of the horse is down, exhausted. It's not a proud Egyptian horse. This is a defeated Israelite horse driving a chariot, or pulling a chariot. Now think about this. If Moses, Yul Brynner, was a contemporary of Charlton Heston, Ramesses II, and this is Ramesses II fighting against Israel, and Israel has got chariots, there's something very wrong there. Moses didn't have chariots. Moses took the people out of Egypt without chariots. If you look through your Bible, you won't find mention of Israelite chariots until the time of late David and Solomon. Solomon, who built chariot cities. All the time before that, whenever the Israelites, who were basically an infantry group, fought against people with chariots, they would lead them into quagmires and swamps so that the chariots became inactive. Or, for instance, when Saul fought the Philistines, he moved his troops up Mount Gilboa so they couldn't use the chariots. The enemy couldn't use the chariots on the slopes. So, for example, in Joshua, the Lord said to Joshua, "You will hamstring the horses and burn the chariots. We have no use for them. We don't know how to ride them. We don't know how to drive them." And a scholar, typical reference from a scholar here, only during the monarchy period did the horse become important for chariot warfare. That reinforces my argument that Shishak is Ramesses, Shishak. Because in his time, he was fighting against the United Kingdom of Solomon and his successor Rehoboam, who did have chariots. And we know that Ramesses fought against Israel somewhere in the hill country.
So, David, what you're suggesting is that the Merneptah poem is reestablishing the greatness of the great defeats that the dynasty, Seti the first and
Seti the first and Ramesses
the second, and that those defeats then are visually represented on the Karnak temple.
Yeah. Essentially what you've got is a pharaoh in his mature years, maybe 65 years old, sitting on his throne, needs some monument to celebrate something, wants to be proud of something. He hasn't done much in his own reign. So he thinks, now what have my family done? Well, all over the walls of Karnak are the records of these wonderful campaigns. So he sends a scribe off with a notepad, a bit of papyrus, says, write down the history of my ancestors, my grandfather and father, write down what they achieved, and I'll sign the bottom of it and say, this is my dynasty, I'm proud of this. So we can then say that Ramesses was the one who fought against Israel, whatever that fight was, whatever that battle was. So that's the situation we're in. We're in a situation where Ramesses has no longer got the bad press of being the pharaoh of the oppression, the pharaoh of the Exodus. He's now a king of Egypt who came up.
And that's one of the key things too. Ramesses is not the pharaoh of the oppression, man, and that's the baggage that has been put on him simply because they see the word Ramesses in Exodus. But Ramesses is mentioned in Genesis as well. These are just anachronisms placed into that time. It's just like if I'm writing a history about the native Indians of the South. And I say, well, they were warring in the state of Texas. You know what I'm saying? And I'm writing a history that took place in the 13th century. There was no state of Texas in the 13th century, but I'm saying they were warring in the state of Texas, the locality of Texas, to let you know that what? You can get an idea, a geographical sense of where that war took place. The same thing in the Bible when it mentions Ramses or Pi-Ramesses. It's just giving you a geographical idea at the time that they was writing it. Okay, they knew what Pi-Ramesses was, or they knew about Pi-Ramesses or where that was located, so they knew where this actually took place in time. So that's all that means. That's why you see these anachronisms in the Bible. It just lets you know where these places, where this actually took place at. All right.
And virtually put an end to the rule of Solomon's dynasty, if you like, with Rehoboam. Rehoboam became a servant of Egypt once this plundering had taken place, as the Bible says.
So the taking of the shields from the temple would have been that defeat.
Yes, the treasures that came out of the temple and from the palace would have gone back to Egypt in the time of Ramesses II, who was the wealthiest pharaoh in the entire history of Egypt. Now, I just want to close with another piece of evidence very shortly, which is very important also to show you that Israel was already well established in the Holy Land, in the kingdom of Israel, before the time of Ramesses. So if Ramesses is the pharaoh of the Exodus, what the heck is going on here? But we have a new piece of evidence, which you'll see in the movie as well. This only came up very, very recently, a couple of years ago. One Egyptologist was rooting around in the basement of the Berlin Museum that nobody had been in for donkey's years, and he came across a granite block from a pedestal of a statue which had been found in Egypt 100 years ago and had been stored in the basement of the museum. And he dusted it down and he started to read the names of the rings, the name rings of the captive peoples, the statue up here, and around the base you have a row of captive peoples. This fragment has 3 captive peoples on it. We're already familiar with them. Ashkelon, Ishkelana, Kiananu, Canaan. And then, unfortunately, sadly broken away, we have a few signs. And he realized that he could restore that name ring, and I'm going to do that for you now. Here it is on the broken edge of the block. Let's put the rest of it in from what we know. And suddenly, we have the name Israel. So, this is dated to the middle of the 18th dynasty, 100 years before Ramesses. And yet, on this block, we have the name Israel as a defeated nation. Israel. So that proves positive for me that there's no way that Ramesses II can be the pharaoh of the Exodus. It's absolutely out of the question. So what we're going to do this afternoon is to tell you who was the pharaoh of the Exodus, who was the pharaoh of Joseph's famine, when it all happened, when Jericho fell. All those things we're going to deal with this afternoon. But this was my journey. This was the way I came to the realization that I couldn't be an ordinary Egyptologist working in my ivory tower, teaching students for the rest of my life, that I had to take this and actually introduce it to the world, because I think it's really important that we realize that the reason why we have the pious myth of scholars about the Bible is because they've made a huge blunder in the way they work the timeline out of ancient Egypt. And that is the key to understanding where the real Bible is located. Thank you.
All right, so that's the end of the clip. So he made some strong arguments. He made the argument about the name of Shishak actually going back to Ramesses and referring to Ramesses because he had a name that he knew was known by as I believe it was Shia or Shisha or something of that nature, and how the biblical writers confused the word Shishak with Shisha. And he made an argument for that. He gave the archaeological reasons to it. He was saying Shoshank never sacked Jerusalem, but in the biblical account it says he did. He went to the Temple of Solomon and took shields of gold or whatnot, and he's attributing that to Ramesses. So he's saying this actually took place during the 12th century BCE, which has ramifications of well, you can't put this Exodus story in the time of Ramesses II anymore if Ramesses II is Shoshank and he's the pharaoh that came in and sacked Jerusalem. It just wouldn't make sense. And also, Merneptah is, I believe, a child of Ramesses II, I believe. Um, and in his stele, the Merneptah stele, it says that he sacked Israel, or as he put it, that the seed is no more. You know how they exaggerate. So we know that he did do a conquest as well too. So if they're already established, then how do you put the Exodus during the time of Ramesses II? It just doesn't make any sense. So I thought it was a lot of pivotal points. I don't agree with David Rohl in everything he says, but he makes a great argument. Another thing I want to share from David Rohl, and pretty much his emphasis on chronology, because he doesn't put Exodus during the time of Ramesses II, which is around the 12th century, but he does put the Exodus around the 15th century, and he gives his reasons why. He gives the plausible Joseph, and I don't know if I should read it or just play his clip. Let me play his clip first. I really wanted to play his clips of him talking. I was like, maybe if I play the clips of him speaking, since it exists on YouTube already, it's pretty much what he's saying in his book. You guys can, digest it better coming directly from the horse's mouth, as we say, right? So let me remove this. Let me share the video about Joseph. He brought out some very poignant points about Joseph. So let's get into that. Let's get into that. Let him speak for himself. David Rohl. It's a video titled Joseph in Egypt. There it is.
David Rohl favors an early Exodus date around 1450 BC. He also proposes a large shift for Egypt's timeline that would align 1450 BC with the end of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. He follows the view of classic Jewish and Christian thought that there were 430 years from the promises made to Abraham to the Exodus, leaving only about 210 years in Egypt itself. This would put Joseph late in the Middle Kingdom's 12th dynasty. If Joseph was so important in Egyptian history, why doesn't he show up in the records?
I think he does.
Really?
Yeah, but you've got to look in the right time for him. If we look in the Middle Kingdom, the period of the 12th and 13th dynasties, we find a very famous vizier called Anku. Now this Anku built granaries. We hear about the granaries of Anku, okay? Lots of Semitic children are named after him. They're called Anku. Okay, so he's a very important character, and he seems to be a Semitic person. So in the book of Genesis, we're actually told the name that Pharaoh gave to Joseph, his Egyptian name. Yosef or Joseph was his Semitic name, okay, but he had an Egyptian name as well. And that name is Zaphanath Apaneah. That's the biblical version of it. It's a little bit garbled, but it looks like this. Za-fen-ath. That's the first part. And then the second half is Apaneah. A-pan-a-ah. Now, there are two elements to this. The first part here, we can recognize what that is in ancient Egyptian, which is Zatenaf. Now, Zatenaf simply means he who is called. And in the slave lists of this period, we actually see that name repeated constantly. The Semitic name, he who is called, the Egyptian name. So they give their slaves Egyptian names. So they name their Semitic name and they say, he who is called, then their Egyptian name. So that's all that means, he who is called. The key is understanding what this is in Egyptian.
Apaneah.
Apaneah. And we think it is Ipi or Apa, Anku. That is how Ankh is pronounced in ancient Egyptian. Aneah. Aneah. Okay. So the name is really Ipi Anku.
So when y'all going around saying I got an unc, or you got to have an unc on, or you got the brother named Unc, the real vocalization of that word is Anea. And Joseph's name would have been Pa-Anea. So check out what he brings out about what Joseph's name means. Zaphanat means he who was called Apapanea. That's his name in the biblical account, which also gives, again, what I was talking about, contextual plausibility. How would they know that this was what was going on in ancient Egypt? You understand? During the Middle Kingdom, they would give the Semitic name and they would give them an Egyptian name. How would they know that? And then give a correct Egyptian name that fits the time period, in the language. Apanea, Zaphanat. Both of these names are metathesis of the vocalization of the metal netter of the Egyptian language during this time. This gives the biblical account the mark of antiquity. Someone living in that time had to gather this information and then pass it down. That's the only explanation. Because we see the names Zephanath, Apapanea, he who was called Apapanea. Now watch this.
That is Joseph's Egyptian name. So that's what Pharaoh called him. Now, Anku, that name there, is the name of the most famous vizier of the period. This is the vizier who built the granaries.
Did you hear what he just said? This is a court. People forget that David Rohl is an Egyptologist. He went to the London University. He was accepted in. Out of, I believe, 97 students that applied to the program, and he was accepted. He was out of the 3 people that got accepted in, and he pretty much made this his life. So when he's breaking this down, his words hold weight, man. All right, let me keep going.
Granaries are named after him. They're called the granaries of Anku, and I think that is Joseph.
So help me with this connection.
So again, that makes it plausible because he said the granaries are Anku, or Anea, Anea, right? Because it's the same word. And I believe Anku means life or something like that. So man of life or something like that. So, and we see these granaries being attached to his name. And also, if you read his book, he's attaching these granaries to a flood and a famine that actually happened in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom. And the flood will happen, the Nile will overflow and destroy the crops. And and even after they destroyed the crops, they weren't able to till the land and replant anything because of the flood. So he makes that connection, which makes it plausible that this Anku, the vizier that's recorded, could have been, in fact, the biblical Jacob, especially because his name matches up with what we find in the Bible, Zaphanat Pioneer.
And this Anku, is it related to this name up here?
Yes. Apanea or Anea is the same as Ankh. Okay, it's the same word. The U on the end, or Anku, simply means he who lives. He's the one who lives. And you remember the story in the Bible when Joseph comes to Egypt, his father Jacob thinks he's dead.
He did,
thinks he's being killed. Mm-hmm. So when Jacob comes into Egypt and he sees his son alive, he says, "My son is alive." So Pharaoh says, "I'm going to give you an Egyptian name, the one who lives."
Oh,
yeah?
Yeah.
So that's how the connection works.
So he knew of Joseph's story.
He knew, of course he knew of Joseph's story. He was the guy who employed Joseph to save Egypt from the famine. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he gave him a name which suited this fantastic miracle that the son was still alive.
So you've seen a connection here with the biblical name in the Bible and this Egyptian vizier or prime minister who built these granaries.
Yeah.
And he was well thought of, and people named their children after him.
And his name is Anku, which in Egyptian means the one who lives.
So I thought that was a very poignant point. You understand? The name lines up. He's known for having granaries, and we know the story of Joseph, you know, 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty, and getting the granaries and buying all of the land from the Egyptians and taking their land and actually using it to make the granaries. So you can go through papyri and papyrus and try to do a comparative analysis, and that's what David Rohl does in his book. But like I said, I was like, okay, should I just read this to y'all or let you guys hear the ideas come from the man himself? And I was like, okay, I just selected to let you hear it come from the horse's mouth and him give his arguments about Shishak, Shishak in the Bible, referring to Ramesses II according to his model, and that Anku one of the greatest viziers ever in Egyptian history, around the Middle Kingdom. And he also notes that it's hard to date him because there's no way to date Anku, but he puts him in the middle kingdom, and he is famous for having granaries, and he's attaching it to the famine that happened around the 17th century BCE. So that's David Rohl's argument. I found it very interesting. You know, this period of time that the Bible is referring to is a time that you know, is very pivotal because it's the age of the patriarchs and the transitioning into the time that we lived in Egypt, and then leading up to the Exodus. So that's why he makes all these arguments and brings this information out. All right. So, you know, I'm gonna leave y'all with that, man. I'm gonna go watch the Suns smack up the Bucks. You know what I'm saying? And you know, in the future, we'll revisit David Rohl and more of his arguments about the dwelling in Egypt leading up to the Exodus. All right. Hey, AJ, how about you debate that? That's debate if what you just said, that you got to be J1 if you're an Israelite, and we can debate that live on the channel here at The Source. All right, let's debate that live. I would love to debate you on that. All right. All right. So with that, I'm gonna bid you brothers farewell. 7-game Source Gang over everything. You know how we rocking, man. Let's get it.
Big business.
RSK, let it play, boy.
When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Serving same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers. When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Serving same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers. I wake up and say me a prayer, brush my teeth, babe, then I throw on some threads. Wash my face, grab a cup, pour me some yum, put on my backpack, then I'm off to the bread. I eat these devils for breakfast, gotta be careful. Whole lot of blood being shed in the streets. World is so wicked, I weep for the living, I drop a free tear for the dead. All my white friends in my pocket, or either they loading onto this black card that I swipe. Say every time that I drop it, the verses be hitting more harder than problems of life. Rich, I collected 2 pennies from every person that willingly gave me advice. Being afraid can't exist in my spirit, I'm fearing no man but the Father in Christ. I put in work with the brothers, we stood on them corners from 10 to like 9 the same night, teaching our people the gospel, equipped with a camera, some posters, some speakers, and mic. Every time that I see mama, she telling me, son, you gotta walk in the light. Christ, the bread of heaven, keep feeding my spirit, and I want a low, not a slide. When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Serving same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers. When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Serving same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers.
When I tell you I'm an Israelite, tribe of Judah, don't you take it personal. Plead the blood on these demons, we purging them. Don't entertain Jezebels, we be curving them. Ayy, I got a ribbon, she virtuous. In person, this blue life ain't virtual. I can't forget when I heard the truth. I got cut with that word, it got surgical. Conviction can lead to repentance. I pray these verses encourage you. We repenting, now we on the vertical. Judah rising, see Isaiah 32. Big business, nothing minuscule. I picked up that pen back in middle school. Guard your light and take heed who you listen to. Watch your mouth and your ears and your vision too. Hashatan and Shalkani won't finish you. In Mortal Kombat, this war is not physical. Gird your loins up and follow the general. Messiah is coming, that's scriptural. Yeah. You gotta starve your flesh. The real war ain't even started yet. This look like a setup for a second exodus. I'm trying to be where the water at. Let's get it.
When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Service, same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers. When I tell them I'm an Israelite, it's big business, not miniature. Service, same thing as minister. Kill the flesh, how to finish them. These commandments, they'll sustain you. I'm surrounded by these angels. I ain't worried, I'm protected from seen and unseen dangers.
You know it'll be gripped up. You know it'll be clipped up. It's 7 candlesticks up, and I've been telling you niggas, it ain't a debate. It's a stick up. Gang!